Good morning, my friends, dear students. Today we are continuing the lecture course of human anatomy. My name is Professor Starchik Dmitry, and we will talk about joints today. And I'm going to tell you about joints in the torso, between torso bones. As I see, you 7 students are present today, and I hope you hear me clearly without problem. If no, let me know. My question is everything correct with translation? As usual, I am asking you to put your name and group number in the chat box. Okay. You also can put your question in chat box, and I'd like to remember you that we have test for this lecture that you can find in the Moodle just after the link of this lecture. You will find the test, and you have to pass this test today. It will be open just after our lecture is finished. Okay, thank you. Thank you for you putting your name, and we are ready to start our lecture. The topic today is arthrosyndesmology. This is a part of anatomy, part of human anatomy, which is devoted to the bones joints. You probably know that human skeleton needs to move, but bones are too rigid to bend without being damaged. Fortunately, flexible connective tissue holds bones together at points of contact, and these contacting points called joints. Joints give the bones degree of movements, and these movements is necessary because without moving it is death. So the life is the moving process, and we will start with this lecture. We will start the part of human anatomy, or another word, anatomy section, termed arthrology, Another term or another name of this section, this part of human anatomy, is arthrosyndesmology. And we will have 2 lectures of arthrosyndesmology in our course. It is an interesting picture you can see here. This is the Russian gymnast world champion Julie Gentel. She is a gymnast, and this type of gymnast section called woman snake, because she has really resin joints. She has elastic joints, and she can do such incredible positions. Here you see topic of today's lecture, and we will talk about basic principles of joint classification and mechanics, joint mechanics. We will talk about also about development of the joints, and then we will study only trunk joints, only joints we can find in between the trunk bones. Firstly, because anatomists very like to classify everything, and we also need to talk about joint classification. As you see, all joints may be divided in 2 groups. We distinguish the first group that is called synarthrosis, which mean inseparable joints, inseparable. It means there is no gap between bones, and usually all of such joints, like synarthrosis, move or don't move. They are fixed, they stable, and it is there is no movement in such joints. The second group of joints are diarthrosis. This is Greek terms. Both of these terms, synarthrosis and diarthrosis, are Greek. They come from Greek language. And diarthrosis, another name is discontinuous or synovial joints. It means the typical joints which provide the movement between bones. Synarthrosis has 2 groups of joints. First one is fibrosis joints. Fibrosis joints means that it is made from the connective tissue. This is some kind of a tissue. Usually it is made from fibrosis structures, and usually these fibrosis joints are soft. It is not hard and rigid, it's soft joints. As you see here, we find ligaments, interosseous membranes, sutures, gomphoses, fontanelles, and chindelizes. This is the fibrosis joints. This is all of group. And a second group in semitrosis, they made from cartilage, and we call them cartilaginous, or in other terms, synchondroses. Usually this tissue, I mean cartilage, is more rigid than fibrosis, than connective tissue. So the sometimes cartilaginous joints start from fibrosis connective tissue and then transform in the cartilage. And the third group in semitrosis is bone union or synastosis, in other words. All of these synchondrosis, synastosis, and syndesmosis, those are also Greek terms. And as you probably see, the prayer word syn means that these joints are touched together and they combine each other, and they are in very close contact. That this is a prevots syn means. Second group, diatrosis. Those are joints. All of these are real joints which give us the possibility to move, and the moving or movement may be allowed with one, two, or three axes. It means that movement, some of the joints, some of the arthroses are able to move just around one axis. We call them one axis joints. Another joints are able to move around two axes, and some of the joints that is most free moving joints, they have three axes, or another term is multi-axis joints. Another classification of the diarthrosis is by shape of the articular surfaces. Some of joints may be cylindrical or condylar. Some of them may be ellipsoidal, sometimes saddle-shaped, spherical, ball-shaped, or even flat joints. So joints may have different shape of articular surfaces. What does it mean, articular surfaces? This is surfaces on the bones which contact each other and produce the diarthrosis. And the third classification subgroup or subdivision of the direct process is the classification by the number of articular surfaces. They may be, we distinguish simple joints. It means that only two articular surfaces is in the joints. But sometimes we see three or more articular joints, then such joints we call compound joints. And let me explain all of the information I just told you with the examples. Fibrosis joints. You see here ligament. This is the bundles of connective tissue starting from one bones to another bones. And usually these joints, I mean ligaments, fix bones all together. They keep bones together. When connective tissue is flat between two joints, like you see here, this is a flat kind of the joints, and we call them membranes. Usually membranes are located between bones of the antebrachium, like here. This is the bone called radius, and another bone which joined with the membrane is ulna. We also find membranes between crucis joints or leg joints, and we find some of membranes between vertebra and skull, and in the pelvic joints as well. Next picture is a picture with the sutures. Sutures is a fibrosis joint composed of a thin layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. Sutures are found only between bones of the skull. By shape, we distinguish three types of sutures. Those are serrate sutures, and as you see, it looks like a zip because there are a lot of angle and a lot of process keep each other, and it really it is look like dentures in the mouth, so we call them serrate joints. Next type of sutures is called squamous suture, and two joints connect like a squama. It is a part of fish skin, and each bones lie and contact with the oblique square or oblique contact, and this type of suture we find between between temporal bone and parietal bone. Usually two of these bones are connected with such type of suture. And the most typical sutures in the skull are plain suture. As you probably guess, this is a contact which looks like a flat surface. This is a contact between flat surfaces. Most bones, most facial bones contact by this type of sutures. Very interesting fibrosis joints is called gomphosis. This is an example of syndesmosis. We see between teeth and the alveolar process in the maxilla and mandibular, and we call it gomphosis or dento-alveolar joint, in which a cone-shaped peg fits into a socket. It means that is cone-shaped peg which is in contact between the bone of alveolar process. Actually, this white layer, I mean this thin layer, is a real connective tissue, and it is like a glue or like a special thin layer fix the teeth in the alveolar fovea. And in other words, is the gomphosis is used in the mechanical or in the industry, when the when we take hammer and hit the nail into the wood. So it is very similar to the organization for contacts of the teeth between the bone of the maxilla and mandible. Next group of the fibrosis joints we call fontaniles. It means fontaniles are like membranes. They exist between the bones of the newborn skull, as you see here. This is a skull of a newborn, very very small child, and these fontanelles turn into the sutures after 2 years. Usually, we distinguish 6 fontanelles on skull. The largest fontanelles is anterior fontanelles, which located between frontal bone and two parietal bone. The second is named posterior fontanelles, and it is located between occipital bone and two parietal bone. These two fontanelles, first one and second one, are unpaired bone. We see only two of these fontanelles, but fontanelle number 3 and 4, called sphenoidal fontanelle and mastoid fontanelle, because the last one is located in the position of the processus mastoid, and these two fontanelles are paired. We see these fontanelles on the left side of the skull as well as on the right side, and usually 3 of these fontanelles, I mean posterior, sphenoidal, and mastoid, they just they disappear or transform in the sutures right after 2 or 5 months after birth, and but only anterior fontanelle we still see even in 2 years child, and after this time it's transformed in the suture. So fontanelles again are the joints we see only in newborn skull. Next, fibrous joints named scindylus is the fibrous junction of bones in which the sharp edge of one bone enters between the split edges of the other bone. It means the one bones, like a sharp edge, connect with the split of the other bones, and the connective tissue here, this is the scindylus. It's a new kind of fibrosis junction. We see this type of joints usually in the skull also, like here between the corpus of sphenoidal bone and rumor. This is a impaired bone in the centrum of nasal cavity. Sphenoidal and rumor. Thin chondroses. Thin chondroses are cartilaginous joints, and usually cartilage is a solid connective tissue that allows little or sometimes it doesn't allow bones to move between each other. So mostly of cartilaginous joints are unmovable joints. Then articulating bones in such type of joints, I mean cartilaginous joints, are tightly connected either by hyaline cartilage or by fibrocartilage. What does it mean? There we have two types of cartilage tissue. Some of is more popular in the human body is hyaline. Hyaline is a special cartilage tissue which is a little bit which is softer than second. And second we call fibrocartilage. It means inside of this cartilage we find the strong fibers of connective tissue. So such cartilaginous joints, I mean fibrocartilages, are quite strong in comparison with the hyaline cartilage. All of synchondrosis may be temporary or permanent. For example, here in the skull we see temporary synchondrosis between occipital bone and sphenoidal bone. It means that after 25 years we couldn't find cartilage between two of these bones at all. It disappeared, but it transformed into the bone tissue. But some of the cartilaginous joints we see all the time in the human body, like costal cartilage. This is a part of ribs which connected bone part of rib to the sternum. Перезвоню на лекции, ладно? So this is two type of synchondrosis are typical for the fibrosis joints. You remember, I hope you remember that cartilaginous joints as well as fibrosis joints are part of syndesmosis, which means not movable joints. Here you see the intervertebral, another examples of the cartilaginous joints. We find this type of joints in the between vertebra, and it calls the symphysis. What does it mean? Actually, the symphysis, this is a type of cartilaginous joints when inside of the cartilage we find the gap or split, and symphysis is the cartilaginous joints in which the ends of articulating bones are covered with the hyaline cartilage, which has a slit inside. Here the slit between the inside of intervertebral disc, and we also find such long or sometimes not very long, but short slit inside of the symphysis, cubical symphysis. All symphyses occur in the midline of the body. For example, the pubic symphysis between the anterior surface of the hip bones, which is slightly movable, is one example of a symphysis. This type of joints is also found at the junction of the manubrium and body of the sternum. Usually symphyses are a little bit more movable than cartilaginous, than other cartilaginous joints, and it is very important for the symphysis pubicum, because especially for women who are waiting the child, and during the process of getting child, when the child come to this world, the pubic symphysis help to move the head of child between the pelvic bones. And the last kind or type of cartilaginous joints is called epiphyseal cartilage. Epiphyseal cartilage. What does it mean? Epiphyseal cartilage are actually growth centers. That is a growth center during endochondral bone formation, and they are not a joint associated with movement. This is just a temporal cartilage, which is the zone for growth. It is a growth zone in bones. All of this gray layer in bone section, they help the femur to grow, because the cartilage produce new bone tissue, and in the end the bone became longer. Next subdivision of arthrosis, or the third group of semiarthrosis, is called synostosis. Synostosis are sites of bony fusion, and they are totally immobile. So this is just lineals between the sacral vertebra, which are fused after some period of time. And also, as example, we see the hip bones, which there are three bones in the pelvis bones. I hope you remember it. First one is ischial bones, pubic bones, and iliac bones, and they are fused in the centrum of pelvic ball called acetabulum. So usually bony unions or synostosis is a product is the final stage of some of cartilage joints. And, when, for example, the epiphyseal cartilage we were talked about, they transform in bony unions. Diarthrosis. Diarthrosis, another term is synonym is synovial joints. You see it here. The synovial joints has three main elements. First one is articular surfaces covered with articular cartilage. What does it mean? This is a part of bones, quite flat and smooth, and covered with the cartilage, articular cartilage. Usually, at least, they distinguish two articular surfaces between two bones. Sometimes it may be 3, 4, 5, but at least the minimal number of articular surfaces should be 2. Then the second main element of the joints is articular capsula. This is a connective tissue layer which covers the articular surfaces and form the third main element of the joints, called synovial cavity. It means this is a yellow cavity between joints which allow them to move. So please remember these three main elements as articular surfaces, as articular capsula, and synovial cavity with the synovial fluid inside. This is very important. You could also see that articular capsula has two layers. The first one, external layers of the capsula, is a fibrosis membrane, but internal layer is a synovial membrane. And typically all joints have the two layers articular capsula. Subsidiary elements of the joints usually help them to move and add another features. Many synovial joints also contain accessory ligament called extracapsular ligament. Sometimes extracapsular ligament located on the surface of the joints, but sometimes in the knee joints we see the intercapsular ligament. Um, Next, subsidiary element of the joints are intra-articular cartilages. They could be like solid cartilages called discs, and partly whole, partly in other words, in solid cartilage like menisci. We find disc, the solid cartilage in the temporomandibular joints, and we find meniscs in the knee joints. There are two meniscs, medial menisc and lateral menisc, and they connect with each other in the centrum of knee joints. Here there are two meniscs inside of knee, and as you see, these cartilages are quite fragile, and they may be disturbed between sport, between some of the sport games, and usually doctors try to fix or put the suture or or connect each other with the instruments, and such operation very popular after sport damages, and usually it happens because of the thin structure of meniscs. Next, a subsidiary element of joints called labrum. The labrum we find in the hip joints and in shoulder joints. This is a part of articular surfaces which has a triangle shape, and it is located in the end of the articular surfaces and help to connect, to join the surfaces between each other, and make the joints more congruent. Next subsidiary element we also find in knee joints is synovial bursa. Synovial bursa are located between the tendons of the muscles and the capsula of joints. Usually synovial bursa reduce friction between the tendon and the surface of joints. And the last subsidiary elements called synovial sheath. This is the blue or blau structures. They are not blue or blau. It is just the way of drawing them. This is a special image, special special way to show these elements in the atlas of anatomy. And it looks like the synovial membrane located around the tendon of muscles, because the tendon come under the such fixation element like ligaments. We call them retinaculum, and between tendon may be large friction. So to reduce the friction, the synovial sheath help to move easily. The classification, this is a classification of joints based on the anatomy or on their biomechanical properties. According to the biomechanical classification, joints are subdivided into the uniaxial, biaxial, and multi-axial. It means that maybe uniaxial joints, biaxial, it has only one. Biaxial, it means they have two axes, and multi-axial, they have 3 axes. It's not possible to have 4 axes because we live in the 3-dimensional space, in 3-dimensional world. So also the joints may move around 1 axis or 2 axis or 3 axis, but not more than 3. And in the connection with their axis, we distinguish 2 kinds of uniaxial joints: pivot joints and hinge joints. 3 kinds of biaxial joints: condylar joints, ellipsoid joints, and saddle joints. And the most number, the maximum axis joints may be plane or may be spherical. Let's explain it by the illustrations. Here you see uniaxial joints. First one is pivot joints, and this is a cylinder between the articular surface, and it looks like door mechanisms. And usually such pivot joints, they move around 1 vertical X, and this is a it's called rotation. According to the biomechanical classification, joints may be such pivot joints, or sometimes we call them trochoid joints. They have round shape or pointed surface, and rotation may be done only around longitudinal axis or vertical axis. Example of pivot joints is radio-ulnar joints that enable, these joints, radio-ulnar joints, and these joints allow the palm to turn anteriorly and posteriorly at the head of the radius pivots around its long axis in the radial notch of the ulna. Another uniaxial joint is the hinge joints or Gin-Linus joints. Here it is a convex surface of one bone fits into the concave surface of another bone. Convex here and concave surface here, they work together and form hinge joints. As the name implies, hinge joints produce an angular opening and closing motion like that of a hinged door. This type of joints typically permit only flexion and extension. So two kinds of movement, for example, in the cubital joints called flexion and extension. The group of biaxial joints consists of includes condylar joint. This type of joints permit movement around two frontal and vertical axes. It means they allow to rotate in the joints and make flexion extension. Examples of condylar joints are knee joints, as you hear. This is the two axes, the frontal and vertical. As well as knee joints, temporomandibular joints is also condylar one, and this is it realizes movement around vertical and frontal axis. Biaxial joints has also variant of joints called ellipsoidal or ellipsoid joints. Here the convex oval-shaped projection of one bone fits into the oval-shaped depression of another bone. Here this is a convex oval-shaped projection, and here is the oval-shaped depression. And the ellipsoid joint is biaxial because the movement it permits is around two axes. In the radiocarpal joints may be frontal and may be sagittal axis. Two axes allow movement like flexion, extension, adduction, abduction, and circumflation or circumduction. It is a combined movement which allows movement just around two axes in the in the one moment. And the final group of the joints is this is the second group of biaxial joints, is saddle joints. Here the surfaces looks like a saddle. Sometimes we call this type of joints cellular joints, where articular surface look like a saddle and bone are saddle shaped. The movement at the saddle joints are the same as those at ellipsoid joints. All biaxial joints allow flexion, extension, abduction, plus limited circumduction. Coming to the multi-axial joints, we distinguish plane joints in this group. And as you see, this is the flat surfaces which have the largest portion of movement around different axis. In plane joints we see 3 axes of movement, and such type of joints very popular for foot or palm joints, where flat surfaces of one bones contact to flat surfaces of another bones. And spheroidal joints, sometimes we call them ball and socket joints. They consist of the ball-like surface of one bone fitting into the caplaic depression of another bone. Here, this is the ball-like surface of the head of femur, and the caplaic depression of the pelvis bone. Such joints as spheroidal bones are triaxial, and they permit movements around 3 axes, and we can do flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, and rotation. Examples of ball and socket joints are shoulder joints and the hip joints, you see here. In some textbooks you may come across the term amphiarthrosis. What does it mean? Amphiarthrosis or stiff joints are joints whose mobility is greatly limited by strong ligaments. In amphiarthrosis, there are short, tightly stretched joint capsula and very strong non-stretching ligaments, as you see here between the pelvis bone and the sacrum. This is the amphiarthrosis. Almost not movable, not sometimes we call it fixed joint, and synonym is amphiarthrosis. Classification of the joints by number of articular surfaces. We distinguish 2 kinds of such joints. Simple one when simple joints are formed by two articular surfaces. For example, the shoulder joints, the hip joints, and many other joints. We see only two articular surfaces in such type of joints. But compound joints, like radiocarpal joints or knee joints, we have one surface, two surface, articular, and also articular surface on the patella. If we have more than two surfaces in one capsula, such joints we call compound joints. And another definition of combined joints. There is another definition of combined joints in that slide. What does it mean? Combined joints are a set of several joints, and they are located separately. For example, the left temporomandibular joint and right temporomandibular joints, but they move together. It means the movements in such combined joints are performed simultaneously. It means in the one time. We could not move the only left temporomandibular joint without moving of the right one. Here you see the joints between the first and second cervical vertebra, between atlant and axis vertebra, and there are three joints. There are three joints between these two vertebrae, but all of these joints and median joints and lateral joints are combined joints, because we couldn't move in one joints without moving in the other joints. I hope you understand this idea. And the last idea is complex joints. Those are joints in which cartilage tissue is located between the articular surfaces, like the sternoclavicular joints. In the centrum of the joints we find disc, which divides the cavity in the two compartment, the superior and inferior parts of joint. Such joints divided in the two etages called complex joints. Sometimes the disc, which is the septum or the wall between the two articular surfaces, may be not solid, not the whole object, like here in first example, but in knee joints the meniscs are not full not full disc, and they have the hole in the center. This is the example of joint movements, and around frontal axis we produce the flexion extension. Here the example of flexion and extension. This is also flexion extension in the cubital elbow joints, in wrist joints, and even in knee joints, as well as in the hip joints. We call also flexion extension in the movement of head, and sometimes we call it anterior flexion here, and sometimes we call the lateral flexion, right and left side for vertebral columns. Around the sagittal axis, we distinguish adduction or abduction. What does it mean? Adduction, when we move the arm up, and when we move it back to the body. This type of movement is called adduction. Don't be confused, because it is very similar. Abduction and adduction. Abduction and adduction are also possible in the wrist joint and in the hip joints and between the fingers. Around the vertebral axis, we distinguish also two kind of movements. With the common name rotation, it is possible outward rotation. Sometimes it is lateral rotation, and inward rotation. Here you see the inward rotation, or it means pronation, and lateral rotation, which is called outward or lateral rotation. The lateral and medial rotation, both of them are possible in the shoulder joints, in the Atlanta axial joints, and in the hip joints as well. The fourth kind of movement called circumduction is the movement when the limb show the circle, like you take the brush in your hand and form the circle on the some surface, on the wall, for example. And it is also circumduction in the hip joints. It is very special movement when we use both sagittal and frontal axis. And some movements are very special. We call them elevation and depression of the mandibular in temporomandibular joints. When we open the mouth, it is depression. When we close the mouth, it means elevation. These joints also has the protraction or moving mandibular forward, and then retroaction when it comes back. This is all special movements in the temporomandibular joints. We also distinguish some of another term with adduction and abduction of the foot and flexion and extension of the foot. We call such kind of movement like dorsiflexion, and when it comes back as a plantar flexion. And the rotation of the upper limb bones called supination and pronation, which means supination, that is rotation outward, but pronation is the inward rotation of only. These terms are used only for moving upper limb in upper limb joints. The touching of the first fingers with another fingers called opposition, and the back movement called opposition reposition. Okay, and here you see the factors affecting range of motion at synovial joints. First of all, this is the structure of or shape of the articular bones. As you probably remember, the most movable joints has three axes, and these are flat or spherical joints. The difference between areas of the articulated surfaces is also important. The more differences we have, the more motions we get in the joints. Also, the presence of axial devices usually reduce the range of motion in the joints, and the combination is also the factor which usually reduce motions. Some roles plays strength and tension of the joints, ligament, and muscles, especially their tensions, influence of the motion, and even the condition of the skin, especially after the burning. The skin becomes rigid, and it decreases the motions in the synovial joints. Here is a description plan for when you start answering in the control set, control block and control test. It is a good idea to use this description plan for anatomy. Here is the next next part of our lecture, we will call, I show you all joints in vertebral column. For example, a combination of different joints between vertebra form vertebral columns. This anatomical structure consists of 7 cervical vertebra, 12 thoracic vertebra, here 7 cervical vertebra, 12 thoracic vertebra, 5 lumbar vertebra, and 5 sacral vertebra, which fuse together. And usually the lowest and the end point and part of the vertebral column called coccyx. Usually it consists of 3 or 5 fused coccygeal vertebrae. Here you see different joints between the vertebra. The main role plays these joints called intervertebral disc. The body of vertebra also connected with the ligament, longitudinal anterior and posterior ligaments. The processes of vertebra has the ligament like supraspinosus ligament, and between two neighbors, two near located vertebra, we have interspinosus ligament. There is also ligament between transversal processes, but the main structure between articular processes helps vertebra to move in different direction. Very interesting diseases come from the intervertebral disc, because inside of the disc we find the fluid called pulposus nuclei. It comes out, just tears the fibrosis annulus fibrosus. This is another part of intervertebral disc, and this coming out portion of the nucleus pulposus usually may press the nerves, and this syndrome is called as a herniated disc. Hernia is the pathological structure coming out from some kind of cavity. Here you see the different curvatures. This is the vertebral column deviation in sagittal plane. We distinguish the lordosis. This is the cervical spine and lumbar spine lordosis here and here, when the curves are on the posterior position, and another curvatures in the sacrum section and in thoracic region called kyphosis. Kyphosis is the anterior nocked vertebra. Usually all of these curvatures forms after birth, when children start to sit to stay and then to walk. Actually, some of people has signs of wrong posture. As you see, this is features or characteristics of the wrong posture, like head is extended beyond, shoulders are brought forward and raised tensely, and when the back is round but chest is sunken. So you have to avoid such posture because it is not very useful for health. And abnormal curves of the vertebral column called scoliosis and hyperkyphosis and hyperlordosis. All of those are abnormal. And this is the name of movements of vertebral column, which and the range, total range of such movement in lateral flexions, rotation, and flexion extension. All of these movements are possible in vertebral column joints. Next is the joints between atypical vertebra, between atlant and axis. Here you see the three joints. I told you already about this. I just take your attention to the ligament which fix these joints, and it calls crucial ligaments because it fixed the dance of the second cervical vertebra and doesn't allow it to come back. Thorax joints form the thorax, and it consists from the ribs, from the sternum, and 12 thoracic vertebrae. Between them is the joints, like between the ribs and corpus of vertebra, we find the joints of capitis rib or head of ribs, and also we have joints between cartilaginous part of the ribs, and this is a flat joints, and only an exception is the connection of the first rib to the manubrium sterni, and that is not a joint, that is the typical cartilage synchondros. Here you see different ligament fixing ribs to the sternum, and here also the joints between the ribs and vertebra. This one called joint of the head of rib, and the second is second called the costotransverse joints. It is another name. Chest shapes is a part of constitution. It depends of the type of body. We have we see some people with large thorax. We call them hypersthenic. And some of people has longer thorax, we call them asthenic, and the conical shape usually have normasthenics. This is that. And here also the pathological chest shapes like ricket thorax and funnel chest. That is abnormal, and also abnormality of the thorax when the sternum is cleft has a gap between two parts. It allows sometimes it comes to the pathological situation when the heart located between the sternum come just under the skin. I hope this all for now, my friend, and in the end of our lecture, I also would like to remind you that to remember you that you have to come to the Moodle and pass the test for the type of joints and type of torso joints. If you have your questions, please, I am ready to answer all what you are interested. No questions. Okay, then thank you for your attention and hope to have a lecture next Tuesday in the same time. The last thing I want to do is to say goodbye and wish you a good day, and hope you will be successful in the test. Thank you and goodbye.